Good good morning and good afternoon to those of us who are joining from abroad. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can hear you just fine. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm surprised that I was introduced as a UN policy expert. I don't know how much of a policy expert I am, but I've been dealing with Cameroon for the last, more than 2 years now at the UN and with member states, including the council members. And we've also had briefings with the members, our members of Congress in the United States. And so many governments, the African Union and the European Union. So I can go into that stuff later. I asked Judith to allow me to speak, and we can talk about strategies in terms of addressing the crisis on an international level. But I'm very excited today to introduce my panelists. They are coming from all over the town, and it's really interesting to hear. I think it's going to be really interesting to hear them speak. So I see Dr. David Mcconnell, supposed to be my first speaker, but he's not present currently. So I'm going to introduce, and I will introduce him when he joins us. But my next panelist is going to be Roxana. Those of us who have been following the Cameroon crisis, she has done an excellent job with these research that came out of Oxford, and I believe she led the research on it. So Roxana is the principal investigator of the Cameroonian Conflict Research Group and a lecturer in criminal law at Oxford University. So her research investigates the legal system through the prism of structural inequality. For the doctorate, she conducted an ethnography at home and examined how one of the most economically disadvantaged communities in England informally handled conflict before escalating it to the police. In response to local requests, Roxana recently established a research group to investigate the Cameroonian conflict. To date, she has set up several research fellowships and led on the production of 2 research reports. Roxana's research in Cameroon stems from working as a human rights advocate for 2 years in the northwest region of Cameroon. So I'm going to let Roxana speak, and then afterward I will introduce our next speaker and have her do a presentation. Roxana, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much for that introduction. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, okay. So thank you for the invitation to join this panel discussion. Today I'm speaking on behalf of the Cameroon Conflict Research Group at the University of Oxford. Some of you may have met my colleague Barrister Mbinka Caroline already at this important event, and Caroline is the person who pushed for the research group to be established. In the last year, our group has completed 2 reports about the Cameroon conflict. The first report offers a review of human rights abuses that have taken place in Anglophone Cameroon, from the plebiscite into the present crisis. The second report is an empirical piece of research that incorporates a diverse range of civilian experiences from the conflicted regions of Cameroon. So I'd like to use this opportunity to reflect on a perspective offered by the brilliant Cameroonian thinker, Akili Membe, which suggests that when international actors think about Africa, they tend to do so through a lens of difference rather than through a lens of common humanity. As Membe explains, and I quote, "We have difficulty feeling links of affinity with Africa. In our eyes, life down there is not just human life. It appears always as someone else's life, as others in some other place far from us, in an elsewhere. They and we both lack the ability to share a common world, so that the African politics of our world cannot be a politics of the similar. It can only be a politics of difference, the politics of the Good Samaritan nourished by a sense of guilt, resentment, or pity, but never by an obligation to justice or responsibility." And they end the quote. I propose that as international actors, we should think about the Cameroon conflict in terms of justice and responsibility, and recognise how our past and present actions have contributed to the crisis. From a UK perspective, for example, we need to reflect on the lasting harms caused by the violence of the transatlantic slave trade. We need to account for when our former government co-opted with France to carve up the area that is now Cameroon. We need to account for why the views of the Southern Cameroonian leaders in the 1959 Mamfe Conference, which called for an option of full independence, were disregarded. We need to account for why nothing was done when federalism was abolished and the Southern Cameroonians became increasingly marginalised. And we need to reckon with decades of ignoring appeals by Anglophone Cameroonians to support the minority in order to prevent a brutal conflict from arising, such as the one that we're seeing today. As our last research report details, international actors are deeply implicated in this conflict, from training and funding an elite armed force that is committing gross human rights violations to entering into trade contracts that are at the heart of the tensions that we're seeing. This is not a conflict between the Francophone state and the Anglophone minority. It is a conflict involving many powerful international actors who are parties to the violence and who have an obligation to help end it. This is why the Cameroon Conflict Research Group calls for multilateral intervention so that meaningful negotiations can take place and peace can finally be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you, Roxana. Thank you so much for that. My next speaker is Juliet Powell. Juliet, pronouncing your name is God. So the last conversation who we moderated had Juliet's colleague on. Now we actually did this. She didn't already moved this. Has a bit of information on the national level. You can tell that if you want later. Anyway, regarding this, Juliet, she's a new research analyst at the Center for Response. She conducts research on advocates for the abolition of mass atrocities, focusing on Cameroon, Nigeria, Sudan, and South Sudan. She leads Global Center's work on a group of friends on RP, in work and research work on UN scheme protection of civilians and Juliet also is the internship at
Thank you, Ifat, for introducing me. I'm not sure if everyone could hear the introduction because your sound was a little bit bad, at least for me, but my name is Juliet. I'm a senior research analyst at the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect, based in New York. And I would like to start by thanking the Coalition for Dialogue and Negotiations for having me on today's panel. And I also want to congratulate you on organizing such an important conference. So over the past couple of days, like in several discussions and statements, I've heard like a couple of things. Like first is that in order to establish lasting peace and stability, dialogue and negotiations are needed, and there's no military solution to the conflict. But in order for that to happen, the government of Cameroon and all other groups need to be pressured into negotiations, and the international community has a key role to play in this. But what we've also heard during the past couple of days is that the international community has not taken any effective action. So the question then becomes, how can we pressure the international community to pressure the parties to the conflict to enter into dialogue and negotiations? And I think that this panel today will be very interesting because I think personally that human rights organizations and civil society organizations more broadly have an important role to play in this. So what is needed right now is pressures on all groups to lay down their weapons and to stop pursuing a military solution to the conflict, but also pressure on the government of Cameroon to launch a credible, inclusive, and transparent dialogue mediated by a third party on a neutral territory, and for all groups to join that conversation. But also pressure on actors that can influence the government of Cameroon to create this environment conducive for dialogue including France, the United States, and regional countries. And last but not least, pressure on the United Nations Security Council to discuss and consider the situation and use the tools it has at its disposal. So states will naturally only act when the political cost of inactions become too high. So we're all familiar with the dire human rights and humanitarian situation in the Northwest and Southwest Cameroons. Yet it has not resulted in genuine and systematic mediation efforts. There are no large relief programs, there's not enough diplomatic pressure, and little media attention. And all this is happening while in 2005, following the genocides in Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, all heads of states and government adopted the responsibility to protect, or R2P. So this was meant as a new operational and political response to accomplishing the aim of never again. This was the idea that the international community promised to never stand idly by when an atrocity situation was unfolding. So they not only committed to responding to a crisis, but also to take steps to prevent such situations from emerging in the first place. So in the context of Cameroon, it is first and foremost the Cameroonian government that has failed to protect its populations. And in fact, it's actually perpetrating atrocities. Secondly, the countries that have a strong ties with Cameroon, donor nations and regional countries, have not effectively encouraged and assisted Cameroon in meeting that responsibility. And thirdly, and ultimately, it's the UN Security Council that fails to uphold its responsibility to protect by remaining completely silent on the matter. So on the one hand, we have that commitment of all states that they would never stand idly by when an atrocity situation is unfolding, and yet there is no effective action taken in response to the crisis in the Northwest and Southwest Cameroons. And I think this is where human rights organizations have a very important role to play. The role of human rights organizations is twofold. Like, first of all, credible research and documentation of violations and atrocities are important to raise awareness and to educate the international system on what is going on. And secondly, human rights organizations are most effective when their research is backed by strong public advocacy and calls for actions and reforms and demands for justice for those whose rights have violated. So human rights organizations are the ones that are holding the international community accountable for their actions, but also for their inactions. They have played important roles in convincing states to adopt Security Council resolutions, to establish fact-finding missions and commissions of inquiry. And no state likes it when human rights organizations are putting a spotlight on them, like either for their actions or for their inactions. And to conclude shortly, I think that human rights organizations and civil society organizations more broadly should join their forces, should amplify the voices of the populations whose rights are being violated, should put pressure on those parties that can influence the dynamics on the ground. And altogether, we must ensure that the costs of inaction becomes too high and that states are constantly being reminded of their responsibility to protect. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me well now? Trying to figure out if it's my mic or I'm not speaking loud enough. Can you hear me well? Kevin, can you hear me well?
Yes, I can.
Nothing. Okay. I think Juliet may not be able to hear me. Please let me know if you can't hear me, and I'll try to adjust or speak loud. My next speaker is Rebecca Tinsley. She's the founder of the human rights group Waging Peace, which has campaigned against the genocide in Darfur since 2004. She has also started a humanitarian aid group called Network for Africa, which provides psychotherapy training in countries recovering from genocide and conflict, such as Rwanda, Uganda, and Sierra Leone. Her novel is about Sudan called When Star Falls to Earth. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here today, so thank you for inviting me. I've been an activist, a human rights activist, since the anti-apartheid movement in the 1970s. More recently, I've been working in conflict zones in Rwanda, Sudan, Uganda, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. The role of people like me is to press the international community to push the Cameroon government to propose a constitutional process that sincerely addresses the legitimate grievances of the Anglophone people. So, how do we get there? History shows us that once we make diplomatic pressure personal, people become rather more enthusiastic about negotiations. That means targeted individual smart sanctions on people who are implicated in human rights abuses. But I have two concerns as someone who cares deeply about securing peace and justice for the Anglophone people. I've been watching this conference since Friday morning, and people are calling on the international community to prevent another Rwanda. But every time I advocate for the Anglophone cause, I find diplomats are simply bemused by how different Anglophone groups put so much energy into denouncing each other rather than identifying all the policies they have in common. For instance, there are people condemning this coalition for being pro-Bia. This is delusional and self-indulgent and frankly insulting. No struggle will succeed if people spend all their time on social media accusing each other of treason or posting atrocity photos or pouring out hate speech. This lack of discipline in your struggle signals to outsiders that an independent Amazonia would be a disaster like South Sudan or an autocratic mess like Zimbabwe or Eritrea. My second concern is that military tactics are not working. There will be no military victory, not for La République, not for the Amber Boys, not for the restorationists. There will only be suffering for civilians. It's easy to sit in an armchair in Houston or Toronto and shout, "No surrender, we fight into death," but it's not working. Common sense tells us that if our tactics are failing, we must find a more successful path. So what's the way forward? There's an honorable reason to call a ceasefire and demand peace negotiations that will force La République into a corner. The honorable reason for a ceasefire is to allow health workers and aid groups to have access to Anglophone communities, first to mitigate the pandemic, and also because humanitarian aid is desperately needed, as everyone listening to this webinar knows. Peace is much harder than war, however. It takes much more bravery to compromise than it does to carry a gun. Civilians cannot be expected to endure more of this, to deprive their children of education, to suspend their economic aspirations indefinitely. And civilians should not be punished if they don't agree with every syllable of the Amber Boys' ideology. This current military path achieves nothing. I know this because I spend so much time trying to persuade the international community to engage with the Anglophone crisis. So in conclusion, I beg you to identify the policies you have in common, not the things that divide you. And I urge you to claim the high moral ground, to challenge La République, to call a ceasefire and hold negotiations. In my experience in other African conflict zones, this is the best chance to engage the rest of the world and to push La République. And may God bless and protect the Anglophone people. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca, so much for that statement. I will get into it more because I faced similar issues, and when I really with the community, and when in our community of New York, this of world sense, and this is something that to talk about. This is something that we need to address. It is the reality, whether or not we have to face it. So my next question was actually the panelists. How do, given the crisis after 2 years, how do we, how does the international play role in the attention to the crisis? You weren't getting attention.
I think your connection is bad.
You
You have a bad connection.
can you hear me better?
Yes, I think we hear you better without the video. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. So I'm going to turn the video off then. My question is to the panelists: what can international NGOs do to bring more attention to this crisis? And Juliet, maybe you can also touch on it because you are also working from New York. And Rebecca, I'd love to hear your perspective more on it. And Roxana, of course, your research will definitely come in handy for moving forward.
Shall I start by answering and then other panelists can fill me in? I think what is most important is, first of all, like credible documentation and research. And in the case of Cameroon, it has been particularly challenging because of the lack of access for humanitarian and human rights situations. And I know that from several colleague organizations, people have been thrown out of the country. So this is a big challenge, because without credible reporting, there is not much like we in New York can advocate for. So yeah, like credible reporting needs to be followed up by a strong advocacy. So my organization is based in New York and in Geneva. We have access to the United Nations, to all the diplomatic missions, the Human Rights Council, the Security Council. So I think that all human rights organizations need to make sure that use of comparative advantage, like we have access to the UN, but others may be located in Brussels who have access to the European Union, the European Parliament, where they can pressure. So I think that we all need to come together and seek out our comparative advantage, see where we can leverage parties. We should together identify the parties that have the biggest influence on the conflict dynamics. For example, France, for example, the United States. And we should all like try to find a way to get in touch with them and pressure them on pressuring the government. Thank you.
Rebecca, would love to hear from you also.
Well, thank you. I agree completely with what Juliet just said. And I've spent the last 3 years trying quite hard to pressure the international community. And again, yeah, I find it very frustrating, because what we need from the Anglophone community is a unified voice, and that is still missing. And as I just said, I also think it's counterproductive to continue on the military strategy when it is so obviously failing. What people have kept saying that they want the UN to get involved, but I think we need a little bit of realism here. You know, the UN is not, first of all, many, you know, if you want to have peacekeepers or something like that, you actually have to have the agreement of the host government, and that's the people in Yaoundé. And you know they're not going to agree to that. The second problem is the UN Security Council is certainly not going to go along with sending in help as long as there's talk of secessionism on the table, because both the Russians and the Chinese are going to veto that. And without having the backing of the Security Council, I'm afraid you don't have peacekeepers. You know, finally, there's a problem in that there's no peace to keep. And so it's somewhat futile sending in peacekeepers when there is no peace to keep. And also, people who are listening to this know perfectly well that there have been groups of the more extreme elements of Ambazonian opinion who are actually threatening people who work for the UN. So, you know, as long as that is happening, as long as the lives of UN staff are being threatened, do not expect to have any enthusiasm on the part of international bodies like the UN to get involved. I'm afraid that has to stop, or else there's going to be no help from the UN.
Roxana, do you want to add something to it?
Yes, let me just start my video. So it's thank you very much. So this is more, I'm hearing a lot about this issue of critiquing the Anglophone cause for being divided. And I wonder if this is a fair criticism, especially obviously talking from Britain. We're a very divided country right now, and it's nearly impossible to get people to agree on anything. It's normal, in fact, in a civil society to have disagreements and different positions. It's understandable, particularly when we look at the current structure of the state that's been put in place, which started with the transatlantic slave trade, continued through to colonialism, carries on now through the laws of immigration and so on. It is a system of divide and rule. That is how colonialism worked. And it has been a system where differences have been pitted against each other. So it's very understandable, I think, from my perspective, why there would be fragmentation among the Anglophone cause. And maybe it's legitimate. You know, we should be able to have differences of opinions and approaches. From our research, so there's probably three main groups which are very different within the Ambazonia cause, and that's three main military groups. There's obviously peaceful groups as well within the Ambazonia cause. There's at least two of the groups are going down the side of setting it up very much like a state and mimicking, as a state and a nation state and independence and so on. And there's another group which has a lot of support, which is actually quite against the whole structure of the state society and how it's been done, and going for a more, anarchist approach, which is challenging the system in different ways. And maybe that is a legitimate challenge that's going on. And I think we need to give respect for people and their differences, and not disregard the different opinions that are occurring.
Could I just make a point there, please? The problem is, if you are presenting the international community with the view that you are having a revolution, or at least a struggle, then if you look at the successful revolutions that there have been, they are usually headed by groups like the ANC in South Africa, which was united, like the SPLA in South Sudan, which was united. We all know that it then fell apart the minute they got power, but like the RPF in Rwanda. And if you go back long enough, like Lenin's Communist Party in Russia. Unfortunately, yes, I agree with Roxana that it would be very nice if we could have tolerance for all kinds of different views. But by its very nature, if you are disunited, you're much less likely to be successful. And I think the people listening, watching today, are looking for a way to realize their aspirations. And that is going to require a more united front, even if it falls apart once you've achieved your aims.
Yes, I'm sorry I can't recall the researcher's name, but I do remember Caroline was on a panel, Barrister Rinker Caroline was talking, and it was very interesting when talking about peace negotiations, and actually how sometimes certain groups can get more when there are differences in opinion. There has been some research that's actually found more has been able to come through negotiations. There's no reason why multiple parties can't be at a table to negotiate peace. And why can't we recognise that there are different interests within the Ambazonia movement who should all be represented at the table in the same way that the state of Cameroon is not one party. There are various, as our research is showing, there are various international actors who are parties to this conflict, who have interest in oil and gas companies and so on, who have interest in the arms being sold, who have interest in training the army and so on. These are all parties, and for the negotiations, can we not all come to the table and talk in a kind of more inclusive way?
And that would be ideal in an ideal world. But my problem is that I think we are still at the first hurdle of trying to engage the international community. Because let's be honest, an awful lot of the people I speak to have actually never heard of what's happening in Cameroon. There is a knowledge gap there, and I'm just feeling that there would be more success if at this initial stage, before we get to negotiations, if the international community know whom to talk to.
I will agree with a lot of the stuff you ladies are saying, it has been my experience with engaging with the US government. The French government has been very hesitant. And as a Canadian, I can say this, that separation is something that the Canadian government will not be interested in. So I see, I think Professor Roberts spoke, so he's another Canadian person, but I can say this, the British government will not be interested because they have Scotland to worry about, and Canada has Quebec to worry about. The United States is not interested in separation. This is the reality, whether we like it or not, whether we like it or not. And China definitely will not be interested in this. So I saw a tweet by Sisiku yesterday. He was speaking on, the Security Council should send something to the Anglophone regions, a fact-finding mission. And I read his tweet and I thought, my God, what does this mean? Is he asking the Chinese government and the French government to come together and the Russian government to come together for this fact-finding mission? And I was thinking, who is going to go to the Chinese government and ask this request? So I think there's so much expectation for us to do a lot of things, but we have to be realistic. And I think when we have people who are all, Roxana, you're completely right. I mean, self-determination is a human right. There's no doubt about this. But whether or not governments, international community will respond well to it is a very different issue. When I speak of Cameroon, the Cameroonian crisis, the South Sudan has been brought up to me every time. South Sudan has been brought up to me every time. And this is because they say that we gave South Sudan separation. And after South Sudan happened, the international community stepped in and to fund the entire time. We don't have the resources to do this anymore. We don't have the tolerance to do this anymore. And one of the issues that we faced was with the African Union. To get the African Union to move on this crisis has been incredibly difficult. And this has been going back and forth between the Security Council members and the African Union going. They're just, it's almost like a ping pong. Nobody really wants to do anything about it. They just say, you should be handling it. And the other party says, no, you should be handling it. And so we have this issue, but I don't mean to take away from the conversation that there's no hope. There is hope. We just have to be very strategic about getting there. And I find a lot of times that I'm speaking to a lot of folks from the region, whether they're Southern Cameroonians, Amazonians, or Anglophones, even I'm very cautious to use the word Amazonia or Southern Cameroon with international community, and I mean governments. I'm not going to meet with the US government and say, I'm not going to say, I'm here to meet regarding the Southern Cameroon. My language is going to be, we have a crisis happening in Cameroon and the minority population are being, there's atrocities happening. We need to do something about this. The reaction will be much different than if I say, I need to talk about separation with you. Can you do this? Because at the end of the day, the United States is a member of the Security Council, and they may be able to do something about the crisis, right? And I'm seeing the comments that are coming out. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those comments. I really appreciate that. Regarding, I want to respond to Professor Roberts on this issue. Let's be honest. The government of Canada does not have enough authority, influence to ask Cameroonian government to come to the table. The only government, from my understanding and my view, and Rebecca, I want to get to your point regarding the United Nations. The only I do not even think the United Nations has the power to do it. I think the only country that can bring everybody to the table is the United States. The French government will, I'm convinced, if the United States says, let's do this, because you can see the United States doing it in various places. You can see Jared that happened in Ethiopia and, Sudan and Egypt. They took on a very strong case, like a strong, whether it failed or not, it's a different case. They've been now they're becoming active in Libya, which is a very difficult crisis. So I do think if you have someone like the United States coming in and saying that let's bring this issue to the table and let's do a negotiation, a third-party mediation, right? So anyway, this is my point. It is personal. I've been working on a crisis for so long that I've, except for China, I think I've met with everybody or spoken to at least with everybody. So my other question would be to the panel. Sorry, I am trying to read your comment. I understand. It's I'm sorry. It is my personal view, my personal experience, and in the case of East Timor and South Sudan, there are a lot of stuff happening, and you have to meet with these government officials, and that you'll get their answer. I mean, and I just to give you a bit of my background. So I've worked on the Rohingya crisis. I was at the International Criminal Court. I've worked at the Rwandan Tribunal. I've worked at the Yugoslav Tribunal and the Cameroons Tribunal. So it's almost like I've been doing so much on focusing on genocide that when I see the Cameroonian crisis, I can see the similarities. But to bring attention that to say international community, there are crises that took place after the Cameroonian crisis happened, and they got more attention. Why can we not get that sort of attention for Cameroon? And for me, that is very important that we do bring this attention to the international community before we can even get somewhere, right? And you are absolutely every right to be upset. You have, because you see these killings every day. Every day I'm getting sent pictures, photos, videos of killings. And so it is very personal to a lot of us because we have friends from the region. We have people who we care very much, even though we're in a different part of the world. We are somehow connected personally, not just professionally, but personally connect to the crisis. And people I love very, very much, they've had their homes burned. They cannot go back to the country. They're very afraid, right? So, and then people like me who may, we're quote unquote part of the international community. We try to use our voice to say, we should do something about the crisis, right? So my next question what's the similarities do you see between this crisis and other crises in Africa? To any of the panelists, feel free, because you've worked on many crises before.
I could maybe start by mentioning like not only how the conflicts look similar, but more like from an international community's response to conflicts, because like these days we're talking about Cameroon and the inaction that the international community what the international community has not done. But Cameroon is unfortunately not the only one country or conflict where the international community is staying silent. Like we've seen this, that the Security Council has failed to resolve like intrastate conflicts that are not on its agenda, or that are on its agenda, like the DRC, Syria, and Yemen. Like the Security Council is active on those countries, but cannot adopt resolutions that contribute to a stabilization in the region. And it's failing to even discuss major intrastate conflicts that are not on its agenda. Like Ifat, you already mentioned, like Myanmar. It's frustrating to see like how a crisis there is unfolding, and also there the international community is just not able to come together. I think when we are trying as an international community or human rights organization to get the international community to move, we must be aware, unfortunately, about the current status where the international community is in. Like multilateralism is under attack, human rights are under attack, everything that we have been building up since the Second World War, basically at the United Nations, is coming under attack. The responsibility to protect was adopted in 2005 after Rwanda and the former Yugoslavia, and even that is difficult to uphold in cases of Myanmar, in cases of Cameroon. So I think there are similarities in the sense of how the international community is not responding. So that's, I think, what I wanted to say.
I see a really strong and unhelpful connections with South Sudan. I mentioned that I'd been involved in the Sudan issue since 2004. Let's be clear, one of the problems in South Sudan, we talk about disunity there. It's also about the egos of the people who were running the different warlords, and the fact that when they then became the leaders of their country, their newly independent country, they allowed their egos to get in the way of creating a unified future. And that should be a warning to everybody in the Anglophone region. But also it has, to use a cricket analogy, it has queered the pitch for the people of South Cameroons, because an awful lot of the international community have learned the lessons from South Sudan. And they're going to be incredibly difficult to convince that secession is a great idea, not least because there's going to be enormous pressure from Nigeria to make sure that Ambazonia is never on the agenda, because if Ambazonia is on the agenda, then Biafra becomes on the agenda. And that absolutely is unacceptable to Nigeria, which of course has enormous influence in Washington because of the oil business. The other point I wanted to make on the similarity, the problem with for the international community in using South Sudan as an example is let's remember one of the reasons South Sudan was actually successful in becoming an independent country. It was because they had the backing of American Christian evangelicals who put this subject on the agenda, and they were relentless. Now, about a year ago, I approached quite a few of those same Christian evangelicals in the United States, and I said, here's this issue in Cameroon. Do we not feel solidarity with the Anglophone people there? Is this not an issue that you could get behind because you were so effective in proposing that South Sudan become an independent country? And I had very disappointing responses from the Christian evangelicals in the States who said basically that the Francophones are not Muslims, so we do not feel the necessary motivation to back the Anglophone side, which means that the Anglophone community needs to find international friends to back it. And that is going to be really hard, not least because of the mess that has been made of South Sudan.
I want to respond to one of the questions.
Could I respond first?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Lovely, thank you. So it's very interesting, I think, politically in terms of what countries are discussed and aren't discussed. There's certainly, so from people I'm speaking to in Cameroon, it's often referred to the Eritrean independence movement, Rwanda. I've also seen Biafra used in kind of an antagonistic way. I think Biafra is a very interesting struggle, especially in relation to what's happening in Cameroon. So obviously we had the complicity of the UK government ignoring the issues as they escalated, not engaging in negotiations straight away, covert interference, so funding the military, funding arms, not talking about it and allowing a crisis to escalate. So 1 million children died from preventable starvation. So I think there are certainly some echoings there. In terms of how the struggle didn't work, it puts into focus the power that's going against certain groups when they're struggling for self-determination, and the power of the international community and the military power and the force. So an issue has been discussed about Anglophone Cameroonians needing to find non-military means. Ethically, I think, especially building on Judith Butler's work, non-violence would be, an ideal. And I wonder, how can we achieve non-violence in such a violent structure when there is so much funding going into these armed military forces that are committing human rights abuses before the conflict? How was this addressed before violence erupted in Cameroon? Well, there's been a lot of petitions from the Cameroonian community to different governments for decades now. This issue has come up. They have gone, representatives from Anglophone Cameroon, they've gone to the African Commission, they've gone to the UN, they've protested with peace branches, which is the biggest act of non-violence. You know, you're carrying a peace branch for protest, and these have been violently suppressed. And it's a slow escalation into this military conflict. No one wants it. It's not normatively good to have this violent situation. But we also need to look at what methods have been tried before and haven't worked. Who are the other parties military in this conflict, which is the international community, and how do we get peaceful resolution within that context? I just want to mention one other thing, talking about self-determination being not realistic. I think it's very interesting. So with Haiti, another case we might think of, at the time it said it wasn't realistic to end slavery and people had to really fight, and it was very not supported by the international community. But actually Haiti has showed us that it is possible to end slavery, and we did see the abolition of slavery come after this. The language of slavery has been evocatively used. It's very recurring from the experiences of the Anglophone communities into how they're feeling right now, still in a state of being enslaved by the Republic of Cameroon. And when you look at the structures, still enslaved in some terms of having resources taken by the international community in that same structure. What we know from research is the concept of freedom. It's never been defined outright. It's always been defined through struggle. The idea of freedom from slavery, that came through subaltern struggle. The idea of freedom involving rights and so on, it's always had to be fought for. I think it's very interesting within what the Anglophone communities are fighting for. They're making us rethink the concept of freedom and rethink the concept of self-determination. And maybe if it's unrealistic, maybe what's being brought to our attention is actually how unrealistic the nation state project was. The nation state, a very modern development, 19th century. We are seeing all over the world problems with the nation state. It's not, doesn't seem to be the right structure to be able to handle distribution of resources, taxation, environmental crises, and so on. So we talk about self-determination as new nationhood, and that's being completely dismissed outright out of hand. But I think more importantly than this, first, it's not for us to dismiss that. We have no, there needs to be a process in which these options are explored and negotiated and discussed. But also perhaps there's something more to the state project, and do we have fair representation within the nation state? How are minority groups represented? We've seen Black Lives Matter and minority groups going out, or not minority in the US, but in the UK context, and struggling for recognition. I think these are important questions that are being brought to us that warrant our attention and shouldn't be dismissed as unrealistic. They're actually really intelligent, important points that we should think about.
Thank you, Roxana. That was a wonderful take on the issue. I'm sorry that it seems like our discussion is very pessimistic. I really want to be hopeful. For me, it's very important that we end the conflict. That's where I want justice. So my point of view is very much, let's end the crisis, and can we find justice for the people who have suffered? And I also believe that in order for us to do this, we need to have negotiation. And I think this is something we can all agree on, that we need to come together and to negotiate the crisis. And then we can move forward. But my issue has been the fact that we are having a hard time getting to that point. We are having a hard time finding a country, and I understand, I think we spoke about the Swiss mediation. to find someone to help us to come together, and I don't mean us, but meaning all parties, and that means the Cameroonian government. The Cameroonian government had been incredibly difficult to bring to the table. And I'm not sure if the United Nations can do anything about this, but I am convinced the US government can do something about this. But this is my personal view, and I hold on to this because I think the US has some power, some leverage over this. They can do something. Whether or not the French government will agree or not, frankly, I'm not. I am engaged with the French. I am engaged with the French. I'm going to be honest about this. We have been pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and asking the French government to ask the US government to come to the table, ask them over and over and over for the last 2 years. We have been raising this issue with the French government. I believe also, Juliet, your organization has been also active with the French government. A few other organizations also behind the scene have been asking the French government to come to the table. And we also, let's be honest, we also notice not the Ambazonia or the Southern Cameroonians or Anglophone Cameroonians are hesitant. It is the government, so we can say that honestly. But the question becomes, who's going to ask the Cameroonian government to come to the table, right? And I was going to ask, my next question was going to be on mediation effort. What can the international NGOs do to push for a mediation to address the crisis? Roxana, maybe you can talk more into this.
Hello, sorry. Could I listen to the other responses and just catch, yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you. Rebecca or Juliet, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, sorry, I was waiting for somebody to allow Juliet to speak, actually. I want to actually, in fact, I want to be optimistic because I think that this resolution that is in front of the US Senate, I really feel optimistic about that. Not least because it is bipartisan, and these days in Washington, that is extremely rare, which must mean that there is some hope for this resolution getting adopted. And from my point of view, the important things in that resolution is getting America to apply targeted individual smart sanctions on recalcitrant members of the Cameroonian regime. Like I said before, if you make this personal to politicians, officials, military officers, they take a completely different view of the need to reform their behavior, because suddenly you bring it into their life. If you stop them being able to go on shopping trips to Paris or being able to get their teeth fixed in London, believe me, then, I mean, they don't care about their own civilians being killed. They never have, and they never will. But they're really going to care if they can't go and buy their Christmas treats at Fauchon in Paris. And therefore, I am really hopeful that if this resolution passes and if the United States applies personal targeted smart sanctions to the individuals who we know have been implicated in war crimes, crimes against humanity, I really do believe that this will push people to the negotiating table. And I agree with Roxana that it is not for us to be saying whether or not secession is on the table. But to be honest with you, my whole aim really at the moment is to make these negotiations happen. And I happen to think, to answer your question, that America, you're right, America is the link in this that could make it a possibility. There needs to be a third party to mediate. From my experience, working with the Carter Center, President Carter, I would have thought his people would do a fine job if they were acceptable to all people, all the parties involved.
I'm seeing a lot of the questions on the table, so I want to personally, I did advocate for the GLOMEG sanctions with the Congress, and I believe that's what you're talking about. What I will do, I'll send the organizers the copy of the sanction platform, or rather the application. And what you need to do is fill it out and submit it. And I do have colleagues who have submitted GLOMEG sanctions against the Cameroonian government. And whether or not they're coming, has been very difficult. But I would like to, Rebecca, just to talk about in terms of also the Senate resolution. My colleagues were working on it, and I do think it's going to make a difference. So in terms of I'm just going to move a bit towards. I'm not Canadian. I'm not British. I'm Canadian who happened to live in the U.S. for a long time. So I've worked with the U.S., I guess, quite a bit on this issue. No, I don't want to say quite a bit. In terms of with the members of Congress and on regarding Cameroon. So I completely agree. I believe targeted sanctions are required. I think targeted sanctions will do what we need the Cameroonian government to do, i.e. come to the table. Once those sanctions come in, and they are, I am convinced, some African governments are afraid of sanctions, and you can look at Zimbabwe. Those are targeted sanctions, but it makes the government move. With South Sudan, the United States ran a sanctions clock, which basically said, come to the table for a peace agreement, or we're going to sanction you. And they ran it for, I don't know how many days, maybe 30 days. The South Sudanese government came to the table so fast. I mean, I have no idea in terms of like what they did, but sanctions work. And I think this is the way to go for Cameroon. And we can talk about how to move forward. We can ask the U.S. government, can we please do sanctions? So David, I'm sorry. So David just signed on, and we'd love to hear from him. So Dr. David Mcconnell is the chair or the owner of BSG Consulting Services and president of Mcconnell Group of Companies. As a philanthropist, then his organization's name is Mcconnell Family Charity, and he is a mediator and peace builder. And he also founded another NGO called United Support for Peace. His humanitarian intervention funded out of his pocket have registered tremendous positive impact, mostly in southern Cameroon's affected areas and population. So he has over 24 years of experience, and he's currently the chairman and the owner of BFG, and would love to hear about what you have to say regarding the crisis and your take on. Dr. Mcconnell, can you hear me? If I'm speaking too fast, let me know. Can you hear me, Dr. Mcconnell? Okay.
I want to thank the Coalition for Dialogue and Negotiations for inviting me in this panel discussion and for organizing this virtual conference on the arms conflict in southern Cameroons. But before I get on the business of the day for which I am invited here, I want to make an appeal to all the people of southern Cameroons of goodwill to know that we are at war. And the only way all of us can survive this war is if we love our neighbor as we love ourselves, and if we are our own brother's keeper. My discussion will be focused on the following roadmap. Since the start of this conference, you have heard from experts who have spoken exhaustively on a wide range of subjects, including the causes of the conflict, understanding of the key stakeholders, and sampling of opinions on key issues concerning the arms conflict in southern Cameroons. My job description today, therefore, is to discuss the role of NGOs, their challenges and possible solutions. And I am doing this in my capacity as president of United Support for Peace NGO and as chairman of Mcconnell Family Charity. The role of NGOs in the armed conflict in southern Cameroon is not different from the role that every NGO plays in the world. I want to go straight to what the consequences of the armed conflict in Cameroon have been so far. The consequences of the ongoing genocidal war are quite extensive in terms of human and material losses. In terms of human lives lost, more than 20,000 people have lost their lives. More than 100,000 people have flown to Nigeria, Ghana, and other nations as refugees. More than 1.5 million people have been displaced internally, and more than 5,000 people are being held in La République on overcrowded, stinking detention facilities scattered all over the territory. This number does not include forceful disappearances and those who are paid and those who pay ransoms in order to be released. More than 2,000 cases of rape have been reported, and more than 5,000 young men have been maimed, and millions are suffering from trauma and in need of psychiatric help. Over 1 million children have been forced out of school and deprived of their right to education. For those who have burned down schools and turned learning places into military camps, they scare the children from going to school. Traditional practitioners that form the backbone of healthcare for people living in rural communities from time immemorial have either been killed or been forced to flee. In terms of material damage, the devastation is quite extensive, enormous, and devastating. It will need something like a Marshall Plan to completely rebuild the infrastructure, villages, homes, hospitals, and the entire economy of southern Cameroon that has been ruined by the Republic of Cameroon in the ongoing war. 5 reasons why the Republic of Cameroon is killing the people of southern Cameroon and destroying their economy. 1, in Fako County, we own 189 million barrels of proven oil reserves, plus 4.77 trillion cubic feet of proven gas reserves. They alone want to enjoy. That is why they are killing us. 2, in Donga Mantum County, we own 600 million tons of proven iron ore deposits. They alone want to enjoy. That is why they are killing us. 3, in Manyu and Donga Mantum, we own 1,000 carats in gold reserves and huge deposits of undisclosed gold reserves in Dian County alone. They want to enjoy. That is why they are killing us. 4, in Kupe Maninguba, Manyu, and Labialem counties, we own huge deposits of undisclosed bauxite, iron ore, gold, and manganese. They alone want to enjoy, while our populations die with hunger and poverty. 5, they kill us because they are French and because we are Anglophones. The French Cameroon got their independence from France on January 1st, 1960, without the boundaries of southern Cameroon. Southern Cameroon got its independence from Britain on October 1st, 1961, without the boundaries of French Cameroon. That is why they are killing us, because we are different. Now, permit me give you the names of some NGOs who, faced with the devastation, economic, political, and human, have come in to help our people. These NGOs include my NGO, MAFAC, that's Mcconnell Family Charity, that is working in Ghana, Nigeria, Guinea, and Guyana. It also includes United Support for Peace, which is still my NGO, that is working in Ghana, Nigeria, Guinea, Southern Cameroons, and here in the United States of America. Others include Mao Global Solutions, Caritas, Médecins Sans Frontières, International Red Cross organizations, food and agricultural organizations, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International, just to name a few.
Sorry to cut you off, Dr. Mcconnell. I'm being told that we need to wrap it up and go back to our earlier question, or rather the discussion. How do we move forward with the...
Let me get how we move forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
You have 1 minute, please.
No problem, no problem. I know how to wrap it up. Now, the way forward out of this, and I'll give you what I have prepared here later to be incorporated into this discussion, is that we, the Southern Cameroon's community in the diaspora should continue, who are carrying the heavy load in helping our people, should not be tired in helping our people, while we should press the United Nations Security Council into passing a resolution that will impose a ceasefire on both sides. And finally, and this is most important, we want all the companies that are working in Southern Cameroons, exploiting oil, gas, and gold, to respect their corporate social responsibility, human rights, and also give a big chunk of their profits that they are making to the NGOs that are trying to alleviate the situation in Southern Cameroons today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mcconnell. Just to go back and wrap up as to what you were also saying, I would love for us to come together, and I think there's some things that we can take on, and I would love the panels to put their input in there also. So there are things that we can do, such as ask for targeted sanctions. So if you are in the United States, please write to your representative, your member of Congress. If you are in the UK, please reach out to your deputy. If you're in France, please reach out also to your deputy and ask for targeted sanctions on the government. It will work. When you have also time, please, sorry, just cut me off. Also, we can ask for a fact-finding mission. That is something that I've worked on, and asking members of Congress to ask the United States to lead a fact-finding mission for Cameroon, and that can be done at the United Nations General Assembly, which we've been pushing, and we need to keep pushing, and we need to keep pushing. And the other thing that we are asking the U.S. government to be the third-party mediator for the crisis. Thank you. I would love other panelists to jump in also and comment on whatever I said, and if you have other things to say.
I will comment, just responding to Dr. Mcconnell's points raised. I think it was really helpful, like outlining the causes of the conflict and you focusing on the trade issues that are going on. And I wonder, so a lot of attention so far has been put rightly on nation states to respond. And I wonder if there's another avenue there on calling on companies to have an ethical, social, environmental, social governance responsibility, writing to companies. In our report, chapter 3, we detail the companies that are involved in Cameroon and trace some links to the BIR and other armed forces. Perhaps that's another route we could all be trying together, which is writing to these companies and calling for a social responsibility where at least there's training for people within Cameroon. Resources are being allocated within Cameroon, and it's just a fairer trade system. Thanks.
At this time, I would love to hear from the floor. If you have questions, please write, I guess. I don't know if you can also ask, but would love to hear. And yeah, maybe we can answer some of your questions.
Can I just say that I thought Roxana's idea of focusing on the commercial entities that are involved, I think it's an excellent idea, because these companies hate bad publicity.
Yeah.
And when you start connecting them to the slaughter of children, for them, this is a corporate nightmare. And in fact, it was one of the deciding factors in the struggle against apartheid, was that enough campaigners started focusing on the companies that were basically supporting the apartheid system, and they made them like lepers, and that began to be the beginning of the end for apartheid.
Thank you. And I'll just say that was a really great contribution, Rebecca, and it was Dr. Mcconnell's idea. I just reiterated, but it's a fantastic idea, and I really hope we do explore it.
Thank you.
Do we have any questions? Can people start typing them now so we can read them? It can't go up, please. I'm seeing a lot of questions earlier, but I'm trying to answer the questions as we move along. So it'd be great if we could, if you can raise your question. I think Professor Roberts, you also raised a question earlier.
In fact, there was a question. I think there is a concern with the comments I'm reading. I will just try to summarize it for you. Where one, the feeling of pessimism from the panel about the quest for self-determination, and the fact that each country has a different story. So trying to say that because it has not worked somewhere else means it doesn't work, it will not work somewhere else. And the fact that self-determination is a right. So people are trying to ask you, the panel, the question, why so much pessimism? And we should realize that each country has a different story to tell. Southern Cameroon is not the same as Biafra. It's not the same as South Sudan. And the constituents of the people doing the Southern Cameroon struggle as well is not necessarily the same as the constituents of the people who are doing the struggles in these other areas. So it's just really a concern from the feedback we are getting. So if that can be addressed, that would be great.
I will, let me try to address this. Thank you so much. Thank you for raising that. And I am not speaking in my own, I guess in my personal capacity. I am just telling you what governments have been telling me. So it is something that they are raising. It's not, I'm not going in there saying, you know, this is Southern Cameroonian conflict is very similar to South Sudan. It's they're saying, listen, they're saying, we've done South Sudan. It didn't work. Why should we move forward with this? So I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm just bringing you what the international community, or rather various governments, have raised with me. It is not any, and I've already said it, like in my perspective, self-determination is a human right. You have every right to that. How do we get there is the biggest issue for me, right? And seeing what has been happening, I would like the Cameroonian government to be held accountable. And how do we do that? How do we bring the Cameroonian government to the table to talk about this issue? Those are my concerns. Those are the issues that I've been working on. So it's not my personal opinion, truth be told. I just worked on Darfur, but that was a while ago. Like South Sudan came out of nowhere for me.
Okay, well, if I may jump in, and I think I like the way you put it. it is not an expression of your own pessimism. It is the perception you've gotten out there following the discussions you've had. But let me move a little bit further. I think the pessimism out there is because of the elephant, the white elephant in the room that they don't want to talk about. You know, when you ask them to come to the table or they hear self-determination, they are reluctant because of the oil. Because the moment you start talking about self-determination, you start putting your nose into the rights, the mineral rights that companies have acquired and who has a signature to those rights versus who owns those rights. So it's like, you know, old men and women feeling so uncomfortable where bones are mentioned. So that is why there is that pessimism. But as a people from Southern Cameroons, we are fully optimistic that our independence or our right to self-determination is a matter of right. It is a birthright. We are not going to give it up. That is why people have died, and that's why people continue to die, and that's why future generations have their lives on the line. And our people, including myself sitting here, we are going to fight to the end using diplomatic means and all other means available to win this freedom. It is a generational thing. If America were not free today, I wouldn't be in America. Some people gave up their lives for me to be free. If it means that I have to sacrifice for my people to be free, so be it. And that's our mentality, all of us. We are fighting for a purpose that is bigger than all of us put together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And this time we'd like to bring in Dr. Fangtang to wrap up the session.
Okay, thank you very much, fellow panelists. I think I have listened very intently to all the discussions that have gone on with respect to the sub-theme, the role of NGOs, of international NGOs in the armed conflict, in Africa, perspectives on human rights and humanitarian response. I think before outlining our takeaway from this particular panel, which has been a very interesting panel and very insightful, I would like to say a few words as a key actor and one of the originators of the protest that became a war. And when we started the protest in 2016, we knew that we were up to a very ferocious government that has used terror to maintain a firm grip on the people of Southern Cameroons. And this, no doubt, has been done with the complicity of some international organizations and countries in the community of nations. We knew that they would not hesitate to bludgeon or to slaughter anybody who stands in their way. That's why we opted for a peaceful movement. We opted for a peaceful protest and asked our citizens to stay in their homes so that once the forces don't see anybody on the street, they will not have anybody to attack. But they still went to people's houses, knocked on their doors, and took their children away. So it is a government that is bloodthirsty, a government that is a committee of esoteric forces, diabolical arrangements that has wreaked havoc and misery on our people. Some of you in this panel I've met some of you in this panel before, and we have had some very useful discussions on some of these things, which I have tried to explain to my fellow Southern Cameroonians on how we need to drive this struggle forward. I'm happy that some of these things have been raised again today to confirm that there is a need for a revision of strategy. And one of the main things that we need to overcome is the divisions, internal divisions. So I believe that after this conference, Southern Cameroonian leaders, politicians, and the stakeholders need to sit together and revise their strategy, putting aside their egotistic urges, their personal interest, and highlighting what is good for our collective, what is good for our people and our collective benefit. I think if we make the mistake now, Southern Cameroons will become a captured people. And so it is important for all Southern Cameroonians to realize after this discussion that it is either we coordinate and organize ourselves and work hard on this thing, or we allow our people to continue dying for something that can easily be achieved. Personally, I am not pessimistic. I am very optimistic, and I think that this fight is a very easy fight, but it can only be achieved if our people hold hands and they work together. Okay, what do we take home from this discussion? The first thing I want to note is that when international experts think about Africa, they do so usually from the point of difference and not from our common humanity. The conflict should therefore be viewed from the perspective of justice and particularly the conflict in Cameroon, and as in that regard, we will be able to find credible solutions to what has set the people there against each other. And in doing so, we should be able to account for certain things, including why there was a disregard for the 8-month conference where Southern Cameroonian actors stated their preference. And we also want to note that this conflict involves international actors who are parties to the violence. And so whatever decision has to be taken, or whatever solution the people of Southern Cameroons are looking for, needs to include those actors. In order to establish peace and stability, dialogue has to take place. The international community has been less involved. Pressure has to be exerted on both sides. Third-party mediation is expected and, as a matter of fact, is indispensable. Pressure on international partners and the UN needs to be a key issue. Action only takes place when pressure becomes too high. And so it is important for the stakeholders to be identified, and the international NGOs need to come together to exert the leverage that is needed for these international actors to do what is required of them. The responsibility to protect was created to prevent a recurrence of what the world saw in Rwanda and in Yugoslavia. In the case of Cameroon, this has not been applied yet. The role of human rights organizations is twofold. They carry and hold international community and bring international the international community to take action based on the findings of their research. Human rights organizations should assist people whose rights are being violated. Once diplomatic sanctions become personal, there is generally enthusiasm for negotiation. The bane of the Southern Cameroon's liberation struggle has been self-denunciation and the lack of discipline that has characterized their interactions. And we note particularly the attitude of some Southern Cameroonians who went out and tried to debunk this conference as an installation of La République du Cameroun, discouraging fellow citizens from attending. Military tactics are only going to bring suffering on the people, are not considered as a solution to the problem. The way forward is to call for a ceasefire and to pressure Cameroon to come to the negotiation table. The sacrifice of civilians should not be abused. They should not be forced to keep their children at home or be inflicted with harsh suffering. Southern Cameroonians should unify their effort and bring La République du Cameroon to the table. This is their best chance. How NGOs can bring world attention to the problem. In discussing this, the panel agreed that there was need for increased documentation on the conflict through research. But this has been challenging because many people have been thrown out of the region. Many people conducting research in the region have been thrown out. International NGOs need to come together and exert collective pressure on stakeholders, the UN, the EU, and France, for instance. A unified voice from Anglophones will help international NGOs do their work effectively. However, the host country may not accept the influence of the UN and other international organizations because they are not ready to discuss secession. China and Russia may be an obstacle at the United Nations. Threats on UN workers by some Amazonian activists have not been helpful. On the other hand, the division among Southern Cameroonians should not be a bane. The fragmentation is the effect of divide and rule, a system that has been installed to maintain the dominance of the colonial power. Organizations like the ANC, SPLA, and RPF are examples of unified movements which succeeded in their quest for the liberation of their people. Whether they split after that is another issue. A lot of people in the international community have no understanding of the conflict. So a better coordination will be indispensable so that public education can be made possible. The case of South Sudan arising from internal disunity makes it difficult for many people to entertain the Southern Cameroon's quest for freedom. The choice of language is critical to strategy that will bring international actors to pressure Cameroon. When we talk of countries that can interfere, that can influence the conflict positively, we think of countries like Canada, but who are hampered by the case. We think of the United Kingdom, who are also hampered by the case of Scotland. But the US has the potential to bring parties to the table and to drive for a negotiation, as was the case in South Sudan. Now, looking at the international community's agenda, we gather that the international community is failing by not discussing questions which are not on their agenda. There are strong connections between the Southern Cameroon's struggle and the South Sudan conflict. We also have, just as there was in South Sudan, we also have political leaders with inflated egos who are stalling collective progress. The fear of another South Sudan is perceptible when you discuss with international actors. There's pressure on Nigeria to ensure that it is not, the Southern Cameroon's issue is not put on the table, lest Biafra becomes an issue as well. The international community has remained silent and provided arms to government parties to the detriment of civilians when it could have been averted from the start. The idea of freedom presupposes struggle, and it has been so for centuries. We need to come together and negotiate the crisis. How we bring Cameroon to the table. The US House resolution is an important instrument which needs to be encouraged. If sanctions are targeted on perpetrators, the war will yield, on perpetrators of the war, it will yield negotiation. Further exploration of organizations, the role of organizations like the Scatter Center could diversify our effort and yield greater results. Some things that we can do. We can ask for targeted sanctions by writing to our members of Congress or deputies, as in the case of those in the UK. Ask these people, ask these representatives to also request for a fact-finding mission at the level of the United Nations during the General Assembly, and ask for third-party mediation. We can also detail the companies doing business in the conflict area and urge them to respect the principle of corporate responsibility. Many companies don't like negative publicity. It is usually a nightmare for them. And that the feeling of pessimism, finally, the feeling of pessimism should not deter Southern Cameroonians from their genuine quest. There is no cause for pessimism. Different views exist on the subject of Southern Cameroon's freedom, but the essential thing is to find ways national perception can be circumvented. I believe that to some extent, what the points I have mentioned kind of capture the essence of the discussion that we have had. Maybe there are some omissions, then the committee can always, the panel can always point that out. But I think to a considerable extent, we tried as much as possible to pick out the juice.
Thank you so much, Fountain. Thank you for that. We're just going to take 2 questions from the floor. Roberta, I don't know if it's possible for the organizers to allow her to speak. I would love to hear from her question. And I believe there's one person, it's BMCA, and then I would love to hear also them raise questions.
Sorry, who was that? What were the 2 names?
Roberta Henderson Musi, if I'm pronouncing it properly. And the other person is BMCA. And then I'm not sure how to say it properly. Also, maybe after we come back, we could talk about how to strategize in terms of how to target the Cameroonian government. I think Fountain did a really good job in wrapping it up, but if you want, you can go more into it.
Roberta is live. Roberta, you just have about a minute. Roberta, can you unmute yourself? Roberta, you're unmuted.
Hello? Hello? Can you hear me?
Your connection is bad. No, I think your connection is bad. I don't think, can we hear her? Okay, we hear you now.
You can't hear me?
Yes.
Okay, just very briefly, as a result of things that came up yesterday, I'm wondering if part of the campaign might be a counter media campaign, because somebody mentioned how the Republic is obviously creating this whole impression that the Amazonians are all terrorists and the whole thing's some kind of madness. I think publicity is really the big issue. And much as people try on the ground, I think we probably need a proper media campaign. Is that a possibility? Did you hear me?
Yes, we can. We heard. Thank you, Roberta. Can we also get the person BMCA to also speak? We can take both of the questions and then answer them.
Sorry, Ifat, can you spell that? We can't find them.
BMCA.
BM, just BM.
Okay.
Kevin, can you find them? We don't see a BMCA.
Well,
I think you can go on and answer the question while we look for the person. We can't find them on here.
Julia, do you want to take on this question, Roxana?
Sure, I can jump in. I think a media campaign is definitely something that is necessary, like together with like human rights reporting and documentation. I think that goes well together. Like in New York, at least, you see that there is, like around the United Nations and the diplomatic missions, there is an opportunity to do extra advocacy when something like last weekend's attack on the school in Kumba or the Nagarbu massacre, there is like an opportunity to seize for us human rights organizations in New York to then push the advocacy. And I think the media campaign around this is important as well. But what I do think what is important, and we have all a responsibility to make sure that we're not only seizing these opportunities when there is something bad that has happened in Cameroon, but that consistently we put pressure. And I think consistent media attention, consistent and credible documentations on rights and violations is absolutely critical in this regard.
I don't know if I may say something very quickly. I think what the media attention truly has major issue in this conflict. I noticed that in the United States and in most international news outlets, if an op-ed is not done on the conflict, we seldom find anything about it. So I don't know what probably Roberta, any specific strategies for an international media buzz on this issue?
I've spent the last 3 years writing op-eds about the slaughter of the Anglophone community and about the appalling human rights abuses being endured by the Anglophone people. And I have to tell you, I have found it incredibly difficult to get any publications interested in what I'm writing about, because most of them just don't, it's not on their radar. What helps to actually get any media coverage at all is when reports come from Human Rights Watch or Crisis Group or Amnesty with hard facts rather than emotion. And therefore, I want to take this opportunity to pay credit to and to salute the work of Amnesty and Human Rights Watch and Crisis Group in documenting accurately what is happening, because you really only get media, in my experience, and believe me, years of frustration. In my experience, you need hard facts and you need personal stories as well to humanize it so that people sitting over their cornflakes in Toronto can identify with what's happening.
Walters has a question for Roxana. I'm not sure Roxana can see it. Maybe you can take on the question, Roxana. His question is, has war profiting developed in armed conflicts, and could this be one of the reasons undermining the call for a peaceful resolution?
Yes, thank you for that. I'm just trying to find the question. Could you just explain that question to me again, please, Ifat? So the question, it's, as I understand it. Yeah, could someone clarify the question for me, please? I think I found it. Has war profiteering developed in the armed conflict? And could this, be one of the, yes, and that's a really difficult question to answer. And I think it's important for us, well, certainly I can talk from the research perspective. This was a feeling from research participants that various different sides are in some way profiting from the conflict. I know there's been issues of accountability that have been raised with some of the militarized separatist fractions and where money has gone and so on, which are kind of mimicking what happens with the Cameroon state. And issues of extortion in terms of on the road. And we did try within our report to make sense, so not to justify the practices that are occurring, but to understand what's happening and why they're occurring. So there are various different forms of kind of, I'd say, extortion, money being taken. And there is a feeling among sometimes this might be felt to be in order to fund the cause and like a taxation type thing. At other times, people are feeling that maybe this is for profit and personal gain. And certainly from colleagues I spoke with, it feels quite disheartening if funds that we use for to advance the Anglophone cause are being misused. I know that's been a current issue that's caused a lot of hurt. But that's as much as I can say on the matter. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment on that.
Well, I'll tell you who's making an enormous profit from the suffering of the Anglophone people, and that is the countries who are supplying weapons to the Cameroon government. And that is Israel, Croatia, Serbia, and France. So if people watching this event want to do something useful, they could write to the ambassadors of Israel, Croatia, Serbia, and France and let them know that they're making money out of the suffering of innocent civilians.
If I may add.
Thank you very much for adding that, Rebecca. That's a really important point.
Yeah, along the same line with Rebecca, if I may chime in a little bit, you add to that list British and French, Chinese and Russian conglomerates. We're talking about companies like Bolivin, New Age Africa, Luke Oil. Those are all companies that are making a huge amount of money out of the blood and sweat of our people. Now, but what they forget to know is that there is a tradition in Africa. When our people die, their blood, their sweat, and their bones, and their spirit all become the resources that we, the living, feed on. So there is no way that they're not going to pay for the resources that they are taking over the blood of our people. So it is very important not just to write them, but it is important to let them know that, this is blood money. And in one way or another, they got to pay it back. And I'll be more than happy to be part of a team that drafts those letters so that I inject those words exactly the way they are supposed to be, so that they can bring the desired effects that we all are looking for. Thank you.
At this point, I would love to ask everybody to say their closing remarks, if you have anything to say, to all the panelists. Dr. Mcconnell, that was excellent. I completely agree, and I would love for you to stay behind and we can talk on this, because I've worked with a colleague in addressing the Myanmar crisis, and they've been targeting companies who are doing business in Myanmar, and it has been very effective. Rebecca, Roxana, Juliet, any closing remarks?
If I could begin, please. Everybody who is watching this, who lives in the United States, I'd like you to get out your pen, and I'd like you to write down this website address, because I'm going to give you an address where you can download a template letter to US senators. I think it's incredibly important that you write to your US Senator and you tell them to support the resolution in front of the Senate on Cameroon. And you don't even have to go to the bother of writing this because we've done it for you. The address is cameroonpeacejustice.ca, cameroonpeacejustice.ca, and you can download the letter and please send it to your US Senator, telling them to support the Senate resolution. Thank you.
I think for me, the concluding remarks would be like short, like join forces as human rights organizations with the populations in Cameroon, amplify the voices of the people whose rights have been violated, educate the international community on what is exactly going on. And like to end on a positive note, like I want to talk about the case in Myanmar. Like even though for years and years there was early warning, atrocities have been committed against the Rohingya minority, eventually now there is an ICC case and there's a case at the International Court of Justice against the state of Myanmar to hopefully hold the government of Myanmar responsible for the genocide against the Rohingya. So even though it looks like no actions has been happening for years, eventually history is catching up with the government in Myanmar.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this incredible panel and for all of the contributions that have been made. It's been a really important discussion today. And just to say on behalf of the Cameroon Conflict Group, and I'm sure everyone here involved in the discussion, that our hearts are with those trapped in the struggle and those with family and friends exposed to the violence. And we will not give up on you. Thank you.
Well, on my part,
Thank you.
I'll conclude by thanking all of you. I have never dreamt of a better day and a better panel like this one in my life. You're just an extraordinary, wonderful group of people that I feel so blessed to work with here today. I just want to look into the camera and address the people of Southern Cameroon who are looking, who are paying attention to us at this moment, to know that we are not going to abandon them. We were blessed by the Almighty God to have left Cameroon so that we'll be here at this time in order to fight for them. That is why God sent us here, where we will not be reached and hurt, because we have a mandate and a duty from God to help them. Some specifically asked me, Doctor, you people should try and achieve unity and collaboration. Let me assure you that it is because of our unity, our friendship, and the collaboration we have with our foreign friends and partners that this conference is possible. These people would not all be here today if we were not working for the same purpose and for the same objective. Now, let me also ask you to focus on your revolution, but not on leaders, and not on groups, and not on fake and bogus peace initiatives that have never existed and that will never exist. If we want freedom, this is the foundation of our freedom that is being built here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Panelists, if you like, please stay around. We can talk about strategies in terms of getting the Cameroonian government to the table. I think you touched on it quite a bit, but I still think we need to strategize and how to bring the government to the table. And it needs to be addressed, and I think we should all come together and work on this issue. And we can talk about the UNGA, we can talk about the Security Council, we can talk about human rights in terms of how to address them and how to go over the, I mean, we spoke quite a bit on this issue, but if you still have any concerns or you want to know more, please stay around. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.